My name is Hannah. I'm 45 years old, a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, my voice steadying despite the knot in my chest. I stepped off the plane and felt an immediate pang in my chest, a tightness that had been absent during my months in Kuwait. At 45 years old and a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, the weight of responsibility usually melted into the background, but returning home was an entirely different battlefield. I had come back to see my dad, only to find an empty house filled with the echoes of his solitude. My heart raced as I thought about how my sister had chosen to spend this weekend lounging on a beach in Cancun while our father was left behind, alone and grieving after losing Mom a year ago. I had imagined a joyful reunion, yet my spirit felt dampened by the thought of his loneliness. As I drove through familiar streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles whitening with anxiety as I thought of the conversations I needed to have, the reassurances I was supposed to offer. I craved the laughter and warmth we once shared around the dinner table, the kind of life that felt like a distant memory now. Instead, I braced myself for the reality of a man left hollow by grief, a man who needed a daughter by his side more than ever. My palms grew sweaty, and the familiar scent of the air, mingled with nostalgia, filled me with both longing and apprehension. When I finally pulled into the driveway, an unsettling quiet surrounded the house. The sun sat low, casting long shadows that danced on the worn porch steps. I got out of the car, hesitating for just a moment, the uncertainty of the forthcoming reunion making my heartbeat quicken. I could already envision Dad's frail figure, the way he leaned heavily against the doorframe, eyes searching for familiarity in the distance. What would I say? What could I possibly say to bridge the gap that loss had created between us? I inhaled sharply, trying to calm my racing heart, but it felt like every breath was a struggle to push through the impending emotional storm. As I reached the front door and knocked, the familiar creak of the hinges was drowned out by the silence within. I waited, each second stretching into eternity, filled with the echo of unspoken words. My mind raced to the moments I'd missed, birthdays, holidays, even just a simple Sunday dinner. When the door finally swung open, I was met with my father's weary eyes, a face that had aged years in just a few months. The moment our eyes locked, I felt a jolt of recognition and sorrow wash over me. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for mine, the warmth of his grip both comforting and heartbreaking. We stood in the doorway, time fractured between us, the years apart amplifying the silence that had come to define us. "I thought you were coming tomorrow," he said, his voice a fragile whisper, as if he were afraid to hope I was really there. I fought back the tears, feeling the weight of his loneliness seep into my bones. "I wanted to see you sooner," I replied, knowing all too well that words would not suffice to bridge the distance between our souls. It was going to be a long weekend, filled with hard truths and painful memories, but the promise of being together, however fragmented, ignited a flicker of hope amidst the shadows. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the untold stories of military women, courage, sacrifice, and truth. Your support helps more voices like mine be heard. Sitting in my father's living room, the familiar scent of old wood and leather mixed with something else, something stale. I had expected to feel a warmth here, a coziness that spoke of family, but it all felt muted. The silence pressed down, heavy like the humidity that often clung to me in Kuwait, yet here it felt suffocatingly different. The pictures on the wall, faded snapshots of family vacations and birthday parties, stared back at me like ghosts. My dad was sitting in his favorite recliner, his eyes fixed on the television screen that was blaring a mindless rerun of some 90s sitcom. I could see the outline of him, but beneath the surface details of his life, he seemed more like a silhouette of a man I once knew so well. I tried to engage him, to pull him back from the numbness he seemed wrapped in. "Hey Dad, remember when we watched this together?" I asked, hoping for a spark of recognition or at least a smile. The tug at my heart was visceral. I needed him to be present, if only for a moment. He turned slowly, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to piece together the jumble of memories. Yeah, he muttered, his eyes drifting back to the screen, as if somehow it held the answers to questions we both dared not voice. The moments stretched like the silence between us, a chasm that seemed to widen with every passing second. I was here, home from deployment, and yet, the distance felt insurmountable. I couldn't shake the feeling that my sister was off sipping cocktails in Cancun while I was left to navigate this emotional minefield alone. I get it, everyone has their own life, their own obligations. But shouldn't family take priority when times get tough? I had always thought of us as a united front, yet I felt like a soldier in a battlefield of forgotten connections. Her absence cut deeper than just a physical one, it felt like a betrayal. I had sacrificed and fought for our family's safety for years, yet here I was, forced to face the reality of his loneliness without her support. It was hard to comprehend how she could allow him to spend his days alone, while I was out here fighting my own battles, always feeling responsible for those I loved. It made me wonder how long this had been going on. I could see the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame, how the lines etched deeper onto his face were not just signs of aging but of a quiet despair I wished I could lift from him like a fog. The loneliness clung to him, as familiar as the patterned throw blankets we'd used for years. I wanted to ask him about his days, to pull the stories out of him one by one. But every time I opened my mouth, I felt the weight of my own frustrations and anger bubble up. Anger at the situation, at my sister, at the fact I felt so helpless. It was a tightrope act, trying to balance my duty as a daughter with the reality of my own life as a Navy lieutenant. As the evening wore on, the sunlight outside began to fade. Shadows crept into the corners of the room, and with them came an overwhelming sense of sadness. I glanced at my dad, still glued to the TV, and I wondered if this was what our lives had become, stuck in endless loops of reruns, both of us too afraid to change the channel. I felt the sting of tears press at the back of my eyes, the frustration swirling with the helplessness. I wanted to reach out, to tell him it was okay to talk about the hard things, to share his worries, his fears, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat there in silence, my heart aching for the connection we once shared, hoping that somehow, we could find our way back to each other. The moment I stepped into my dad's living room, an unsettling hush wrapped around me like a shroud. It was a stark contrast to the cacophony of military life, a world where every second hums with purpose and urgency. But here, in this quiet home, my dad sat slumped in his favorite armchair, a well-worn recliner that had seen better days, surrounded by the remnants of his life, old books, faded photographs, and a collection of vinyl records, relics from a time when music filled the air. Now, all I could hear was the soft tick of the wall clock, an unyielding reminder of time passing without meaning. I had flown halfway across the world, yet in that moment, I felt a million miles away from the version of my dad I once knew. The television flickered in the corner, a news report silently flashing images of chaos from another corner of the globe. I often found solace in those broadcasts, knowing they reflected my operational world, the one that demanded my focus and training. I shifted my gaze back to my dad, who didn't notice me at first, lost in his thoughts. The wrinkles etched into his skin seemed to deepen with the weight of solitude, as if he had been carrying the burden of his loneliness for years. Memories sparked unbidden, a montage of family dinners, the smell of his famous beef stew wafting through the house, laughter echoing off the walls. Those memories felt so vibrant, so real, yet here I was, faced with a man whose laughter had all but faded. He finally looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes sparkled with recognition. But that light quickly dimmed, replaced by a shadow of confusion. I offered a tentative smile, a fragile bridge over a chasm of years lived apart. "Hey, Dad." My voice cracked slightly, my military composure faltering in the face of this private emotional battle. I had taken orders in hostile territories and faced threats that made my heart race, yet nothing compared to the ache of seeing him so diminished. The reality of his solitude hit me like a wave, threatening to drag me under. As he blinked slowly, processing my presence, I saw the remnants of our past flicker behind his gaze. It was the same look he wore when I made him proud, when I earned my stripes and made rank, but there was no joy now, only a profound loss that echoed through the silence. My sister was off soaking in the sun, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was absent, just as much as he seemed to be missing parts of himself. I had read the reports of her excursions on social media, each post a reminder of the life she embraced, while I had chosen the rigors of duty. A wave of resentment washed over me, followed by guilt, a tangled web of emotions that felt too heavy to carry. "Want to watch the game?" he finally asked, his voice raspy but steady, as if he were grasping for a lifeline, something familiar to anchor us both. I nodded, swallowing my own feelings, knowing I needed to be present for him, even if it meant burying my own sense of loss. As we sat together, the sound of the game filling the room, I found myself straining to hear his voice above the static of my thoughts. Each cheer and groan from the screen became a reminder of what we had lost and what we might still have, if only we could navigate through this new landscape of our lives. I wanted to break the silence, but for now, I would follow his lead, hoping against hope that somehow, we could bridge this chasm between us. As soon as I stepped off the plane, the weight of nostalgia hit me like a wave. The air in Virginia was thick with the scent of pine and the familiar earthy notes from years of family gatherings. It clung to my clothes and wrapped around me, a reminder of evenings spent around the dinner table, laughter spilling over like the wine in our glasses. I found myself in a haze of longing, thinking about the last family reunion, how my dad had looked then, his silver hair catching the warm glow of the sun as he told stories of his own father, the proud lineage I had always taken for granted. But now, as I drove toward the house where I'd grown up, I felt a tight knot forming in my stomach. Things had changed, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the reality that lay ahead. Arriving at the house, I paused outside. The familiar creaking of the front door echoed in my mind as if it were a cue for memories to flood back. Inside, the place was just as I remembered, the same floral wallpaper peeling at the seams, the slightly warped floorboards that always squeaked beneath my weight, and my father's worn recliner, its fabric faded and frayed like so many cherished moments we had shared. I half expected to see him sitting in it, reading his paper or watching the news with his glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Instead, the room was eerily silent, and an unsettling chill crawled down my spine. I felt an ache in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something is amiss but you can't quite put your finger on it. When I finally wandered into the kitchen, there he was, my father, a shadow of his former self. He was hunched over the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood like it held the answers to questions neither of us dared to ask. I noticed the empty coffee cup beside him, a stark contrast to the countless mornings we had shared over steaming mugs and hearty breakfasts. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a cautious smile. "Hannah," he said, his voice escaping him like a breath of stale air. We embraced, but the warmth I sought eluded me, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that he had been alone during what should have been a time of family connection. I couldn't help but think of my sister, sunbathing on some beach in Cancun, her laughter echoing in my mind, a stark juxtaposition to the silence that enveloped our father. How could she prioritize a vacation over spending time with him? The thought ignited a flicker of resentment that threatened to grow. It was one thing to serve my country, to stand on foreign soil keeping my own family safe, but what about family here, at home? I wanted to reach out, to shake her out of her blissful disconnect. There was a sense of betrayal, weighing heavily on my heart, yet I couldn't speak it aloud, not in front of him. I had come back to be with him, but my sister's absence loomed large, a gap that felt like a chasm. As the evening wore on, the conversations were stilted, punctuated by awkward silences that felt like unacknowledged elephants in the room. I tried to engage him, to pull out stories of the past, but it was as if I were prying open a sealed box that he no longer wanted to explore. He seemed content to linger in the shadows of his memories, a haunting reminder of how life had shifted without warning. I felt the familiar tug of duty within me, a call to protect and serve beyond the uniform I wore. But here, I was simply his daughter, grappling with my own feelings of inadequacy. I had come to visit, to reconnect, but instead, I felt like a visitor in a home that was slowly slipping away from both of us. I stood at the foot of my father's bed, the smell of antiseptic air mingling with the familiar scent of old books and forgotten memories. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow through the partially drawn curtains, but it was enough to illuminate the wrinkles on my dad's face and the weary lines around his eyes. He looked frail, like a once mighty ship that had been docked for far too long. I felt a pang of guilt for being the one who had come back and found him like this. My sister was in Cancun, lounging on a beach while I was here, tasked with navigating the uncharted waters of this new reality. The contrast made the weight on my chest heavier. "Hey, Dad," I said, forcing a smile even though my heart didn't quite agree. I felt a rush of unfamiliarity, though I had always been his daughter. Here, standing before him, I was just another visitor in the hospital. The silence stung, a quiet reminder of what my absence had meant. I had always believed that my career, my commitment to serve, would somehow justify the time I spent away, the sacrifices both he and I had made. But now, facing the truth of his solitude, I questioned my decisions. Had I really served my country, or had I just served my own ambitions? My dad blinked slowly, trying to process my presence. "Hannah," he murmured, as if testing the name after so long apart. I sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to jostle him, and took his hand. It felt cool and fragile. I wanted to share stories, to assure him that I was still the same daughter who had once drawn crude sketches of warships in crayon, dreaming of the day I would wear the Navy uniform. Instead, the words caught in my throat, weighed down by the realization that my victories abroad hadn't translated into comfort for him here. The distance I had kept from home felt like an anchor, dragging me down as I tried to prove I was worthy of his pride. As the hours slipped by, I fumbled through mundane conversations, sharing snippets of life on the base, the camaraderie among my fellow officers. My dad listened silently, but I could tell he was drifting, the haze of medication clouding his focus. I yearned to see that spark in his eyes, the pride he used to wear like armor. I wanted him to see me not just as a daughter taking a brief leave from duty, but as a woman who had fought for honor, for respect. Yet, how could I convey that in this sterile room? My uniform, which had once filled me with confidence, felt like a shroud now, suffocating any sense of accomplishment when juxtaposed against my father's vulnerability. Eventually, I found the courage to say what had been gnawing at me. "Dad, I want to take care of you," I confessed. "I know I've been gone, but I'm here now. I want to make things right." I watched his expression shift, confusion giving way to a warmth that momentarily chased away the shadows. "You've done enough already, sweetheart," he said softly, and I could see flickers of the man who had taught me resilience and courage. But the words only deepened my resolve. I had to prove that I was still capable, even if it was in the small acts of care, making arrangements, managing his medications, or simply being there beside him. In that moment, I understood that proving my worth was no longer tied to grand gestures or accolades. It was about showing up, about being present as he faced the daunting complexities of aging and illness. I squeezed his hand tighter, feeling the warmth of connection ignite hope within me, and I prepared to fight not for medals or recognition this time, but for a man who had given so much to the world, and, quite frankly, to me as well. I was determined to honor him in every way I could, even if the road ahead was uncertain. I stood in the living room of my father's home, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The weight of the moment pressed on my chest as I took in the starkness of it all, the faded family photographs on the walls, the dust collecting on the furniture, and the empty chair where my sister usually sat, a conspicuous absence in a space that used to buzz with laughter and warmth. I squeezed the thick fabric of my navy blue cardigan, a habit I had developed over years of dealing with the weight of my own responsibilities. I was used to commanding troops, making tough decisions under pressure, but standing here, simply being Hannah, the daughter, felt overwhelming. My sister was in Cancun, sipping cocktails under the sun, oblivious to the loneliness spiraling in our father's heart. It was then that I caught sight of him, slumped on the couch, staring blankly at the television. He had been my rock, the one who taught me to be brave, to face enemies head-on. Yet now, he seemed to be an entirely different man, lost under the burden of solitude. I watched him for a moment, my heart aching. I thought about my time in Kuwait, the adrenaline rush of deployments, the stark reality of life and death. There, I had faced chaos and uncertainty, but returning home to find my father so defeated cut deeper than anything I'd experienced in the line of duty. I realized that confronting difficult truths was just as crucial as any tactical maneuver. Gathering my courage, I walked over to him, my combat boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and sadness. I sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but still worlds apart. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. I felt the urge to fill it with words, to promise that everything would be okay, but I knew the promise I could make would be laced with uncertainty. Instead, I placed my hand on his knee, a gesture that said more than words could convey. In that moment, I hoped he could feel the love and strength I carried. We sat in that shared silence, my mind racing through countless memories, fragments of our lives intertwined like the threads of a well-worn tapestry. I remembered him teaching me to ride a bike, how he'd run alongside me, holding on to the seat until I found my balance. I had thought that once I learned to ride, I would never need him in that way again. But I was wrong. Life's challenges were different now, more complex. I needed him just as much, not just as a father, but as a partner in this journey we were both navigating alone. In that moment, I decided we could face this together, like we had faced everything else. "Dad, I'm here," I said, my voice firm, a hint of the officer I was trained to be creeping in. "We can get through this. You don't have to do it alone." I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a spark of hope igniting amidst the shadows. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I had learned on the battlefield that sometimes, victory wasn't about conquering in the traditional sense. It was about standing alongside one another, embracing vulnerability, and facing the harsh realities of life together. In that moment, I was not just a lieutenant in the Navy, I was just Hannah, his daughter, ready to take the first step toward healing. I never thought coming back home would feel so overwhelming. After months of serving overseas, I expected to step back into my life like it was a well-rehearsed drill. But nothing prepared me for the sight of my dad, all alone in his worn recliner, the afternoon sun casting a long shadow across the living room. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like a photograph fading at the edges. My sister was in Cancun, sharing margaritas with friends, while I struggled to make sense of the quiet that had settled in. I wondered if she'd even thought to call him today, or if she was too busy enjoying the sunshine and the sound of waves to give a single thought to the man who raised us. I approached my dad cautiously. He looked up, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the sparkle in his eyes I remembered from my childhood. But it dimmed quickly, overtaken by a heaviness that mirrored the room. The issues of our family had shifted while I'd been away, tensions simmering beneath the surface, miscommunications festering like open wounds. I sat down beside him, the familiar scent of his aftershave cutting through the air. "Hey, Dad," I said softly, fighting the lump in my throat. "It's been a while." He nodded and gave me a weak smile, but the warmth in that moment felt like a thin layer over an ice-cold lake. There was so much left unsaid. The conversation was stilted at first, stumbling over mundane topics like the weather and his favorite shows. I could hear the silence stretching out between us like a chasm, each of us hesitating to leap across. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me coming home, it was about reconnecting, finding a way for us both to be honest about our lives. "Dad," I finally said, wading through a sea of hesitation, "I know things have been tough since Mom passed. I'm here now, and I want to help." The words hung in the air, waiting for a response. He sighed deeply, the weight of our shared grief pressing down on him as he finally met my gaze. The next few days felt like a slow march toward understanding. We ventured out for small errands, just the two of us, navigating the aisles of the grocery store and the familiar paths of our town. It was a way to anchor ourselves in the present, to create new memories that would, hopefully, help us forget the emptiness left behind. I didn't want my sister's absence to linger over us, she'd made her choice. So, I pushed through my own discomfort, instilling courage in my conversations, knowing that persistence was key. Each small victory, a laugh shared, a meaningful glance, felt like a tentative step toward healing. I left my dad's house on the last afternoon with a bittersweet heaviness in my chest. I still felt the distance between us, but something had shifted. We weren't estranged, we were learning how to be family again. It felt like a growth spurt, painful but necessary. I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away, taking in the sight of him, standing there, waving goodbye. I realized that while this wasn't a quick fix, it was a start. In the military, I've faced challenges that demanded persistence and courage, and maybe, just maybe, this would require the same. I was determined to keep coming back, to be there as he rebuilt, and in turn, to rebuild myself in the process. I watched the gentle sway of the palm trees from the porch as I sat outside my father's house, heart heavy with a sadness I hadn't prepared for. It was supposed to be a reunion, something joyful to break through the monotony of my deployment in Kuwait. I had envisioned laughter, shared meals, and the comfort of his familiar presence. Instead, the reality of his solitude struck me, leaving me feeling helpless. At 45, I was well acquainted with loss, the kind that comes from serving in the military, the kind that scabbed over but never truly healed. Yet, witnessing my father alone, the weight of his years evident in the lines etched into his face, made me realize that some scars run deeper than my own. I'd never imagined how vulnerable he had become in just a few months. The pictures of my sister's sunny vacation in Cancun burned in my mind. While she sipped cocktails on the beach, my dad, who used to be the anchor of our family, sat alone, waiting for my return. I understood that she needed her break after the relentless pressures of her job, but the stark contrast stung. The glances I exchanged with him spoke volumes. He didn't need to say a word for me to feel the weight of his loneliness. I fought against the frustration that bubbled inside me, wrestling with the urge to call her and confront her carelessness. After all, it shouldn't have fallen solely on my shoulders to keep him company. We planned a dinner at his favorite diner, a place that seemed grounded in time, where the booths felt like they had absorbed decades of conversation. I watched as he fidgeted with his napkin, a man who once commanded the room easily now reduced to a quiet shell. As I stirred my coffee, I found myself searching for the vibrant stories of my childhood, the ones I felt should pour forth with ease, yet the silence stretched between us like a chasm. The jokes that used to roll off his tongue were replaced with deep sighs. I couldn't help but feel that my years away from home had not just stolen my father's vitality but a piece of my own heart as well. As the night wore on, I brought up the memories of our camping trips, the times when we used to sit around the fire, exchanging stories under the stars. He managed a smile, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes, and for a brief moment, I felt the warmth of our bond crack through the surface of his isolation. Yet, it was fleeting. When his gaze drifted away, I could see the shadows creep back in, that familiar grief of past losses, the absence of my mother that left a void he'd never learned to navigate alone. I wanted to reach out and tell him it was okay to talk about her, to let the tears flow freely, but I sensed he'd built a wall around those memories, protecting himself in some misguided sense of strength. Returning home had not just meant visiting my father but confronting the painful realization that life continued to change around us, often without our consent. Our family dynamics had shifted, leaving him without a partner and me without the comfort of a sister who could help shoulder the burden. My heart ached for both of us as I leaned closer, wrapping my fingers around his hand, a silent promise that he would not face the twilight of his years alone. I knew I had to be vigilant, to remind myself that while I was the officer in charge when I donned my uniform, at home, I was simply his daughter, and he needed me to be both. I stepped into the local diner, the worn linoleum floor reflecting my somber mood. The familiar scent of bacon and freshly brewed coffee washed over me, tugging at memories of my childhood. I spotted the usual crowd, old friends, former classmates, and neighbors who had known my dad long before I joined the Navy. They looked up as I entered, quickly burying their eyes in their meals, but it was too late. I knew they recognized me, but lingering gazes turned into whispers, and before I reached the counter, the murmurs morphed into hushed admiration. "There's Hannah, the lieutenant," one of them said. I nodded in acknowledgement, but the warmth of their recognition left me feeling oddly hollow. It was supposed to feel validating, yet all I could think about was how many of those same faces I hadn't seen in years. As I slid into a booth, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, and not in the way I would have welcomed during my deployment, where it felt good to wear my uniform with pride. Here, dressed in jeans and a navy blue sweater, I was merely an outsider in my own hometown. I had spent so much time away, and with each passing year, I felt less connected to the life I left behind. The accolades I earned, the rank I held, meant little in a place where the most significant conversations revolved around local sports and gardening tips. My heart sank again at the thought of my dad being alone while everyone else was busy discussing their lives. Then came the awkward smiles, the nervous laughs, and finally, the questions. "How's it feel to serve your country?" an old neighbor asked, his voice unsteady. I smiled politely, knowing I had a rehearsed answer for those who asked. "It's an honor," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but even I could hear the stiff edges of my voice. The truth was much more complicated: the long deployments, the missed family events, and the gnawing loneliness that sometimes crept in, even among comrades. I served to protect, to serve a purpose, but coming home felt like diving into a pool of unfamiliarity. The admiration felt heavy, like a weight I wasn't sure I had earned. Over the next several minutes, I sipped my coffee and took in the sights and sounds of the diner. My eyes fell upon the wall of photographs showcasing the town's proudest moments: high school graduations, community picnics, and the occasional military send-off. Each captured moment reminded me of the ties I had once cherished, now frayed by distance and time. I caught sight of my dad's photo from a few years past, smiling with his hand raised in a wave, surrounded by family. The sight made my heart ache. Here I was, a lieutenant recognized for my sacrifices, yet my dad was the one who had borne the heaviest burden, enduring loneliness while everyone else was moving forward. When it was time to leave, I caught the gaze of one woman who had been watching me since I entered. "You know, Hannah," she said softly, "we're proud of you. Your dad brags about you all the time." Her words clung to me like a lifeline, yet the pang of guilt mixed uneasily with gratitude. I was proud to serve, but all I wanted was to share that pride with my dad. I realized that in my quest for recognition, I had almost forgotten the one person whose approval mattered most: his lonely heart amidst the applause. As I stepped out of the diner, I felt the weight of his solitude with me, and the ache grew stronger. I didn't just want to be recognized, I wanted to reconnect with a man who had given so much while I was away. I stood at my dad's front door, hesitating before I lifted my hand to knock. The last time I was back home, he was a picture of vitality. But now, the shadows under his eyes seemed to tell a different story. The house felt too quiet, too empty, as if it had absorbed the loneliness that seeped from every room. My sister, Rachel, was living it up in Cancun, posting pictures of golden beaches and sparkling blue water on social media, while Dad held court with silence. I felt a wave of anger rise in my throat, threatening to spill over as I thought of how easily she left him behind. But could I blame her? It was complicated. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and knocked, the sound echoing through the stillness. When he opened the door, I saw a flicker of surprise cross his face. "Hannah?" He stepped back as if unsure his eyes weren't deceiving him. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the warmth of his body against the chill of my frustration. I knew how to keep my distance in the face of overwhelming emotion, a skill honed during years in the Navy, but right now, I just wanted to be a daughter. He patted my back, but it felt like more of a reflex than an expression of joy. I pulled away and searched his face, but there was a heaviness there that I hadn't anticipated. "How you doing, Dad?" "Just fine," he replied, though I could hear the tremor in his voice, the way it wavered, as if it were grasping for some semblance of stability. As we settled into the living room, the familiar scent of wood polish filled the air, but the usual warmth was missing. I glanced around, noticing the way the dust clung to the furniture and how the light from the window failed to brighten the corners. "I went by your favorite diner today," I said, trying to steer the conversation towards something easier. The burgers are still the best. His smile was fleeting, a shadow passing over his face. I'm just not hungry lately, he murmured. The words hung between us, sharp and unyielding. It was time to confront the elephant in the room. Dad, I know Rachel's out enjoying herself. But shouldn't you be doing the same? I watched his face fall, the tightness around his mouth growing more pronounced. I can't just pick up and leave, he said, his voice barely a whisper. There's too much to take care of here. But you need to take care of yourself, too. I felt frustration boiling inside me. You can't just sit here waiting. You're still alive, Dad. You deserve to enjoy something. He looked away, as if my words were tangible objects he could throw aside. I saw the hurt flash in his eyes. You sound just like Rachel, he said quietly, and each word felt like a punch to my gut. For a moment, the air between us crystallized, filled with unspoken grievances and deep-seated fears. I could feel my walls cracking, the military training that had served me well suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of my father's vulnerability. That's not fair, I countered, the heat of my voice catching us both off guard. I'm not saying you need to jet off to Cancun. I want you to think about what you want, Dad. I need to know you're okay. He finally met my gaze, and the weariness that had settled into his features twisted my heart. I took a step closer, urging him to see that we were in this together. I came back for you, I added, my voice softening. I didn't come here to fight. I need to know you're fighting for yourself, too. I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the walls of my father's house when I arrived, sounds so distant, so foreign. I took a moment on the doorstep to steel myself, reminding myself that behind this door was my dad who had always been my rock. But now, the image of him sitting there alone, a stark contrast to the vibrant scene I could hear, gnawed at the edges of my heart. I had come back from months of deployment in Kuwait, yet here I was, feeling more like a visitor than family, wondering what had brought us to this point. The door swung open, and there was my father, his face lighting up with surprise and joy, but it quickly faltered when he caught sight of my expression. Hannah, he said, stepping aside to let me in, his voice shaky. I hugged him tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of his aftershave mixed with the mustiness of the house. It felt good to have him close, but I couldn't shake the weight that had settled on my chest. I thought about how little I knew about his life while I had been away, how my sister had chosen Cancun over a family dinner she could easily have arranged. The sharp pang of betrayal hit me again, but I swallowed it down, trying to focus on what mattered most, being present for my dad. As I looked around, the decorations from my sister's recent birthday party still adorned the walls, a stark reminder of her absence. My father seemed to sense my gaze and shuffled into the living room to rearrange a few items on the coffee table. I wanted to ask him how he felt, if he was lonely, but I didn't want him to feel as though he needed to defend his decision to host a party without me. Instead, I smiled and asked about his friends, the ones I never met. He lit up, animatedly describing their antics, but the ache in his eyes made it clear that these moments were no substitute for family. I didn't want to ruin what little joy remained, but I could feel my frustration building. This was the first time in years I had stepped back from my duties, a chance to reconnect with my roots, only to find my father leaning on social distractions while my sister basked in the sun. Dad, we need to talk about what's been going on while I was away, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I want to know how you're doing. The air grew heavy, a solemn cloud descending between us as he shifted uncomfortably. I was aware of the challenges of being an officer in the Navy, with the emotional toll that came with long deployments, but I was his daughter first. It felt disheartening to realize that perhaps neither of us were prepared for the real impact of my return. Eventually, we settled down into the sofa. I needed him to know that he wasn't alone, that he still had me. I wanted my father to see me as more than just a visitor but as someone who respected his dignity and cherished our relationship. I could hear his friends still laughing outside, a sound filled with life that felt almost taunting. It's okay to be lonely, I said finally, my voice softer now, but don't shut us out. I wanted to tell him that it was okay if he didn't want to talk to me about everything. It was enough that I was here, just as I had always been. I wanted him to understand that this family required effort from all of us, and now that I was home, he had my unwavering support to weather whatever storms lay ahead. Looking back on the past few days, I realized that my trip home was more than just a fleeting visit, it was a confrontation with years of unspoken feelings. When I arrived at my dad's place, the silence was palpable. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of Kuwait, where I had grown accustomed to the buzz of life, the urgency of duty. Here, in this small house that once felt so vibrant, I found him sitting alone on the couch, the TV flickering in a half-hearted attempt to fill the air. I had come to reconnect with him, but instead, I felt the weight of isolation hanging heavy between us. My sister was off in Cancun, sipping drinks beneath palm trees, while our dad navigated his solitude in slippers and an old t-shirt. I had always sought validation from my sister and the people around us. Their laughter at my dreams, their dismissive looks when I told them I wanted to join the Navy, hung over me like a shadow. But standing in my father's living room, I finally understood that the need for approval was just a tether tying me to their narrow expectations. In that moment, I saw my father's disappointment, not in me but in a life that had drifted away from the bright laughter of family dinners and shared moments. The realization struck me, I didn't need their approval anymore. I had fought battles in far-off deserts, and every challenge I overcame had brought me closer to the person I am today, a strong, independent woman, ready to carve out her own path. As I sat beside him, I started sharing stories from my deployment, tales of camaraderie and courage, a world so different yet oddly similar to the one he had known. I could see the flicker of pride in his eyes, but it was also tinged with regret that we had lost precious time due to choices made by others. We clung to those moments like lifelines, building bridges of understanding over the chasms of isolation. Each laugh shared, each tear shed, seemed to breathe life back into the walls that had grown too thick with silence. I watched as his wistful smile shifted into something more powerful, a hint of the man I remembered as a child, full of dreams and belief that I could conquer the world. There was an urgency in my heart that day, an awareness that time waits for no one. I made a promise to myself, to my father, and ultimately to my sister, to prioritize connection over expectations. I would not be diminished by the need to seek approval from those who could not see my worth. It was time to turn the page and embrace a new chapter, one where I could live fully, unapologetically, and authentically. The silence in the room no longer felt suffocating, it transformed into a canvas where we could paint our shared journey anew. As I prepared to leave for the airport, I caught a glimpse of the sunset through the window, a brilliant mix of oranges and purples bleeding into one another, a reminder that endings can also be breathtaking beginnings. I stepped outside, inhaling the crisp evening air, and understood that like that sunset, I too had the power to reshape my narrative. With every challenge and every triumph, I was becoming a mosaic of all my experiences, the shattered pieces coming together to form something beautiful and uniquely mine. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from.